This is the first episode in a two-part series, and the first case in our season covering cases in Georgia, Illinois, and Montana. This series discusses homicide, possible sexual assault, domestic violence, and the details of a crime scene. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. If you're from Atlanta, maybe you remember what Inman Park and Little Five Points were like back in 1990. We grew up here, and we can still picture the sister neighborhoods pretty clearly. Intown Atlanta, before the inevitable spread that has turned treasured landmarks into parking decks and loft-style apartments. It was a time before city officials had finished constructing the Olympic dream. They hadn't yet bulldozed entire housing projects so completely that song lyrics would be the only proof that they'd ever existed at all. Back then, Little Five Points was grimy in the very best way. Artsy and weird, where the punks and the skaters gathered, and you could buy vinyl records. Though it's only a few miles from the center of downtown, Inman Park was the city's first suburb. Back in the 19th century, a few miles distance, that meant a lot more. In 1990, Inman Park, it was both safe and affordable. It was on the edge of more expensive but still accessible areas like Virginia Highlands and Morningside, but also close to Boulevard and Midtown, which saw much higher crime. And when we say close, we mean that. A drive down Ponce de Leon Avenue and a few turns to the left or the right could take you into class stratospheres separated by just a few blocks. Now, everything has changed, of course. Most neighborhoods have survived, though many have rebranded. Midtown thrives now. Little Five Points is still a little weird, but it's been tamed. Inman Park is now prime cafe culture real estate. Back in 1990, the going price for studios in the Inman Park area was in the realm of $250. Many of those were tucked into converted Victorian homes. It was affordable housing for young people who flocked to Inman Park and Little Five Points and worked 2 or even 3 jobs, searching for whatever came next. That's what 22-year-old Princella Eppes was doing back in 1990. Princella, whom her family called Lady Bird on account of her delicate features, she'd been living in Metro Atlanta for a little over a year. It wasn't her first time in the city. As a toddler, she'd spent a year or two staying with an aunt and an uncle in the Little Five Points area. Then she came back home to Massachusetts, and she stayed there, at least until she finished school. In the mid-1980s, Princella's oldest sister Kim left Massachusetts to attend Spelman College in Atlanta. Pretty soon, their mother, Marianne, she grew worried about Kim being so far away. And it wasn't long before Marianne picked up and moved her husband and her younger children down to Georgia. They settled in southeast Metro Atlanta off Flat Shoals Road. Lady Bird stuck around Massachusetts for a while, but eventually, she made the journey too. Princella spent her first year in Atlanta living with her family, and then with friends. According to her sister Kim, she worked all over the city, making money in all sorts of ways. She drove the horse carriages downtown that take visitors on scenic tours of the sights. Sometimes, she could even take her youngest sister Ebony and her teenage brother Curtis for rides. That was exactly the kind of job that they expected Lady Bird to take. She was free-spirited, and she loved meeting people. She was still looking, Kim told us, for her path in life. Princella also worked at a dry cleaner's in town, run by a woman named Star. Star was a neighbor of their mother's. That's how the two met. And with the money through those jobs, Princella saved enough to get a little studio apartment. It was on North Highland Avenue, in Inman Park, and close to Little Five Points. That complex, it still exists today. Princella rented her new place the last week of June. Her family are hazy on the particulars of when she signed the lease, but they know that she was thrilled. According to Kim, the apartment was a few hundred square feet of combined living space, a kitchenette, bathroom, and bedroom. Princella moved her belongings in between shifts at the dry cleaners, and she set about making the studio her own. Princella did not have a car, so she talked with her mother, Marianne, about shopping trips to buy all the things that she was going to need. It was hot that summer. It always is in Atlanta. Temperatures hovered around 90 the first week of July. But that did not dampen Princella's excitement. She planned to pick up her 12-year-old sister, Ebony, so that Ebony could spend the weekend with her at the new apartment. It was supposed to be a fun girls' adventure for them both. Some family members recall that Princella was to get Ebony after work on Friday night, July 6. Ebony remembers the plan being for Saturday evening, the 7th. Either way, though, Princella never showed. Sunday passed, and then, on Monday morning, July 9th, Star called from the dry cleaners. Princella hadn't come to work. And that just wasn't like her. She was never late, and she never missed her shift. When the family checked in with Kim, she hadn't heard from Princella either. It took some hours for them to arrive at the apartment building on North Highland Avenue. When Marianne and her husband walked up to Lady Bird's door in the oppressive late afternoon heat, what struck them first were the flies. They swarmed, seemingly everywhere. And then they noticed the smell. They called police, who reportedly entered the apartment with the assistance of maintenance staff. Inside, a responding officer from the Atlanta Police Department discovered Princella Eppes lying on her bed, deceased. She was unclothed, and her cause of death appeared to be a gunshot wound. There was no sign of forced entry to her apartment. We found only one article in the local papers that related to her case. On July 11th, the Atlanta Journal reported that APD had confirmed Princella's cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head, and that she had last been seen on Friday evening. Then Lieutenant Danny Egan spoke with reporters to give an official statement. Based on his comments, the Journal wrote that, quote, "Investigators do not have a motive or suspect for the shooting. There was not indication anything was taken from the apartment." To her family's understanding, there were no indications that a struggle had taken place in the home. And that was the beginning of the nightmare. Questions without answers, and a case without any strong leads. Marianne went down to APD, and she spoke with detectives. But the rest of the family, the younger children and Kim, who was only 24, they weren't much apprised of the investigation. There were witnesses who were questioned, and some information reported to authorities. But none of it seemed to point in any clear direction that could identify the person or persons who would come into Princella's apartment that night. Marianne says that she did not hear much from APD, and maybe there wasn't an update to get. But then a year passed, and another, and another. There was still nothing on Princella's case. Kim and Curtis and Ebony grew up. They built families, and they built careers. They waited. Their own children grew older than Princella ever had the chance to be. It wasn't until 2016, when Ebony, her youngest sister, reached out to the Atlanta Police Department for the first time in years, that they began their first steps to finding out more. But that is a story in and of itself. We first became aware of Princella Eppes' story when our colleague Haley Gray let us know that her family was interested in more coverage for Princella's case. She'd been working with Princella's oldest sister Kim for about a year at that point. We were aware that Season of Justice had just approved a grant for Princella's family, and that an awareness campaign was set to run a billboard timed with the 34th anniversary of her death. They'd found billboard space at the Grady Curve on the downtown connector, where highways converge in Atlanta. On any given day, the DOT claims that 500,000 or so cars drive down those lanes. It's a good place for a billboard. And in a case where it's been 34 years with no answers, it may be the family's best shot at gaining the public's attention. That, and the new $10,000 reward. But getting to that point, it's been a long time coming. And we've been asked to help get Princella's story out as far as it can possibly go. First, though, you need to hear about who she was. The little girl who stood up for anyone that she thought needed protection, and the woman who set out to conquer a big city on her own. The sister and daughter whose case her family desperately wants to see resolved. We sat down with her oldest sister Kim a few months ago at her home in an Atlanta suburb. It's a house that's surrounded by plants and full of light and full of the gorgeous quilts that Kim started making since she retired from her career as a professional school counselor. Over the years, Kim has spent a lot of time advocating for young people, and now in her retirement, she says that she wants to put all that energy towards advocating for Princella. In some ways, it's her new full-time job, but she tells us that she feels driven to do it. After all, if she and her siblings don't, who will? They have gained supporters over the last few years, but it all started with them, just like back in childhood. Kim told us that while she was born in Ohio, the family moved to Springfield, Massachusetts before Princella was born. As we said, Princella spent a few years living with relatives in Atlanta when she was a toddler, but they were all back together in Springfield for most of their childhood. Kim was 2 when Princella was born, and we asked what their relationship was like when they were young.
She was annoying to me. I was the older sister. Yes. And even though mom, dressed us alike, we did everything together. We traveled together. Where she was, I was. We weren't twins, but you would not really have known that. But still, we were different. I was sort of quiet and shy at the time, and she was just extremely gregarious. No matter where she went, people gravitated to her. She was that social. And so I would let her be in the limelight because I didn't want it. I didn't want the limelight. And she just had lots of friends wherever she went. People just loved her wherever she was. Today, when I think about her personality and who she was as a kid, she was inquisitive. She had lots of questions. She challenged. Well, why do I have to do that? I didn't learn this until we started talking to people about who she was, is that for the first couple of years of her life, she did not actually live with us. I think wherever she was, she picked up from that environment the ability to question. And she brought that back to us, and that's who she was. She challenged the status quo. She got in trouble a lot. She knew what she wanted, and she would go after it. The example that I always give, people typically ask me, what do you remember? What's the best story you remember about her? Well, this didn't happen while she was young, but when I was in college, I was 18, she was 16. And I had come home from college, my very first year. And I had one piece of luggage, probably about half this size of half this table. And for whatever reason, we left it in the van. I don't know why. But all of a sudden, we were sitting in our family room and we were watching TV. And we all heard the alarm go off on the van. But I heard it, it takes me a minute to process it. Like, what's happening? But she jumped into action because that's who she was. And she jumped up, she got to the front door. She was jumping over fences and stuff to go get this person who was walking down the street with my piece of luggage, trying to run because he saw my sister coming after him. And it was a male, but we never found out who it was. But either way, he dropped that piece of luggage and my sister came back to save the day. That's the amazing part. Yeah, she had fears, but she wasn't the type of person who would think about it. She would act first and think later. It's just who she was. Because when she came back to the house, we all talked to her about her safety first, that is what had to come first. Like, thank you for saving the day and bringing me back everything that I own in this world. I really do appreciate that. But I would not have wanted you as my sister Bird to be hurt. And of course, we all had that conversation and then laughed about it. That this is something that, this is just who our sister was. So you ask about her being younger. She was, some people might describe it as a protector or a bully. She didn't bully people just to bully people. If you were in her circle and she felt like you were being bothered, she was going to stand up and she was going to say or do whatever was necessary to bring you some relief. Yeah. And that's how she was known in our community.
The baby of the family, Ebony, was 10 years younger than Princella. She and Curtis, their brother, they were still in school when Princella passed away. When we interviewed Ebony for this series, she told us that Princella's no-nonsense way of handling things stuck out in her memory. She said that Princella would always stand up for what she thought was right.
My older brother, Curtis, I used to always go into his things and wear his items to school because my mother would have me dress one way and that wasn't the cool way to dress. And so after he went to high school, because they would always leave early in the morning, I would go in there and have my pick at whatever I felt I needed to wear to school to look the part. And I would get into the schoolyard and, put my stuff on. And, I was cool at that point. Mm-hmm. So I had his hat. It was a king's hat. And there was a guy, I won't say his name, but he found himself with my hat and wanted to tell everybody that it was his. And he was going to keep it. So he was like, no, that is my brother's hat. And, you really just don't understand. I'm going to have to deal with this brother when I get home. And so there was a teacher, Miss Wiley. She retrieved the hat and took it and was like, it's nobody's hat. I'll keep it, because she couldn't prove one way or another. So when I got home from school that day, Lady Bird was there and I told her what had happened, what had transpired. And hey, you got to save my life, because once we call him Curtis, his nickname is Codese. Once he understands that I took his hat to school, he is going to kill me. And so Lady Bird came walking up through the schoolyard. She's here to save the day. So she walked up on the school property and she went in, and she was adult. She was old enough to have the conversation. And she tells the teacher, this indeed is my sister's hat. We actually purchased it, and she gave the whole story. And the young guy who said it was his couldn't really dispute it, because now you got an adult telling you that it's ours. And so the hat was handed over, and she saved the day before my brother knew that it was missing. I don't think he even knows to this day that it was missing. Yeah, she was a caretaker, just had a genuine care for people, but she didn't take mess off of anybody.
But it wasn't all facing down bullies and chasing thieves with Princella. Everyone we spoke to talked about her restless curiosity for the world. She was intelligent, with an interesting mix of intensity and free-spiritedness that you just usually don't see. As Ebony and Kim told us, Princella both liked logic and creative expression in equal doses.
She did puzzles. She was a puzzle fanatic, and I'm talking about 3,000 piece. Like the biggest puzzle you could think of, all these pieces. She would sit for hours and do puzzles. So she had a very brilliant mind as well. And then when she would get done with these beautiful scenic pictures of birds or pastures or what have you, she had a method, and she would take it and put she would have cardboard or whatever to cover however big it was and flip it. And she would glue the back of it, and she would hang her puzzles. She kept money from different countries. She kept recipes. She wrote, she journaled. Lady Bird was just super creative, crafty. I was already an imaginative kid well before she passed, but I think her attention to detail, her joy for life, she loved collecting things and making things. I think I've picked up a lot of that. And I think I am really creative as far as in my crafting. I do a lot of crafts because of, how she started off. I'm inspired by a lot of things that she started when I was a little girl. And I know she used to work for Oshkosh and Hallmark. She would bring home like trinkets, pencils and paper lunch bags with prints on them and stationaries and things like that for me. And so I love things like that now because of who she is.
I say to everyone that what I know about my sister is that I think that her forever job would have been something that allowed her to journal and write. My sister had the most beautiful penmanship that I have ever seen. Now, of course, they used to teach penmanship. They don't anymore. But she had beautiful handwriting, and she used it often. She journaled about everything that she did. We don't have access to all of those journals. We don't know where they are. But she journaled everything. And one of the things that I noted about her was that when she would journal, whether it was a story or she was talking about something that had happened to her, she would illustrate it. So she'd go out into the yard, she'd get some flowers and she'd dry them out, and then she'd put that in her journal. And so I say she was scrapbooking long before I knew what scrapbooking was. But my sister had many hobbies, many interests, and I don't know that she loved any one hobby more than the other. She just loved everything she did.
At the beginning of the episode, we mentioned that the family all followed Kim to Atlanta. Kim explained to us how that came about and why it took Princella a little longer to join them.
So at 18, I graduated from high school and then came here to Georgia, Spelman College. There's a whole funny story about it. You know, I'm her first child, and she called me one day when I was on campus just to check in, and I was actually not in my room. And my roommate at the time told my mom that I was at some kind of party in the park. And I always like to say that from that, my mother decided that the family was moving down because she needed to stay, a little bit more in contact with me. And honestly, she brought sisters, she brought aunts, uncles, cousins, literally, even my grandmother at some point came down, and mom was the catalyst because we were all in Springfield, Massachusetts. And in fact, I had planned to move back to Springfield. But amazingly, the one person who did not come when mom brought family down was my sister, Princella. She did stay in Massachusetts for a couple more years. I think just to work and live, that was her community. And I guess the better question for me is what brought her here? I'm thinking it would have been my mom. The fact that the entire family was here and she was there, by herself pretty much. I believe she lived with various people at the time. I know that she lived with my stepmother at some point, who is in Massachusetts, and didn't stay there long, but moved around as she was trying to figure out her life and do the adulting thing. She had graduated from high school and she was working, but I'm not sure exactly where she lived, all the time that she was there. But at some point she made the decision. I remember her being here for holidays. And I actually thought she had gone back to Massachusetts, but after speaking to the family members, they're pretty adamant that she did stay here.
When Princella did move down, it was around Christmas time of 1988. Ebony, who was in middle school at the time, she remembers it clearly.
She was living with us initially, right? And then she moved in with one of my mother's friends who lived not too far down the road in this big community that we were in, but not too far. I could walk there. So I would stay the night over there.
Princella began working right away. Kim says that she was always working, and she'd pop up with new opportunities all the time. First, she was driving horse buggies downtown, and then she was at the dry cleaner.
And I think she was just searching for what she was going to do with the rest of her life. She didn't necessarily have a plan. She wasn't that kind of person to have a 4 or 5, 10-year plan. But I think as opportunities came up, she was willing to accept those opportunities to see where they would lead. Mm-hmm. And that was what was so neat about her. Yeah. You never knew.
It took about a year and a half of work before Princella decided to move out on her own. The family can't remember precisely when she made that decision. It's more that they recall that she found the apartment, signed the lease, and then the moving was underway. It would be her very first time living all on her own. And in Inman Park, she'd be some distance away from the rest of them. Kim was in Clarkston, which is an East Metro suburb, and her parents were further southeast.
Did you get the sense that your mom had any fears or concerns about Bird when she moved into the apartment?
I did not get any sense that Mom had any concerns. My mother tells this just hilarious story of one time Mom was in the apartment, she had been there a week, and Bird was trying to figure out how to cook on her stove. And she had bought these dishes, but she didn't realize that the dishes weren't the type where you could cook on the stove. And because Bird was trying to figure it out, so
Were they melting onto the...
I don't know. But my mother, she was like telling her, you can't cook in those. That's not for that. That's for you to eat on or do something else with, Not that, so.
She was just living her life.
She was living her life, and it's what Bird did. Mm-hmm. And she would be here or there and do something different because that's just who she was. So this is just another chapter.
Kim was working and in grad school, so she didn't talk to Lady Bird every day. But their brother Curtis, he had a good sense of what was going on in her life. This would be important later when questions arose about who Princella might have known and who she might have felt safe letting into her apartment. Though she'd only been living in that apartment for a week, she had gotten to know some of her neighbors, and Kim told us that wasn't unusual. Princella was extroverted, and people liked her. She was always one to speak and to strike up a conversation. Later, a witness would tell police that she thought Princella was dating one or two men based on the people she saw in or around the apartment building. But when we asked Kim about Princella's social life at the time, she didn't think that was actually accurate.
I'm not sure that I would characterize it as dating. Maybe hanging out, but I've never met anyone that I would call, quote unquote, her to be dating.
Based on witness descriptions, as noted in the police summary, Curtis told Kim that at least one of the people described was likely a family friend, and none of the siblings knew Princella to have a serious boyfriend. That doesn't preclude her from dating, of course, but in terms of her life in July of 1990, as far as her brother and sisters knew, she spent most of her time working, and she didn't have a serious relationship to speak of. She was on friendly terms with Star, her boss at the dry cleaner, and she spent a fair amount of her free time visiting her family at their homes. They also thought that she wouldn't have had a boyfriend that they knew of who would have come to stay at the apartment that particular weekend, because they doubted that she'd simply failed to pick up Ebony in favor of spending time with a man. As far as we know, her plan for that weekend was to pick up a television from her parents' home and then bring her little sister over for a sleepover. She had to report to work first thing on Monday morning, and there was no reason to think that she'd deviate from any of that. Princella was someone who did what she said she was going to do. Ebony remembers waiting at her parents' house for that promised sleepover. She was excited. She hadn't seen her big sister's apartment yet, and being with Princella was one of her favorite things on earth. We aren't sure how Princella had arranged to pick up Ebony since she had no car, but Ebony knew that was the overall plan. And as the day drew on, she felt that something wasn't quite right. Princella's phone had not yet been installed at the apartment. She was using the line at the dry cleaners when she needed to make a call, so they couldn't just check in and see why she was late.
And I believe that was going into that holiday weekend. I don't remember what day of the week it was, what July 4th was that year that she died, but that weekend in particular, I was expecting her on Friday, and she never did come. Could have been a Saturday night. It was one of those nights. I was waiting for her, and she never did come. I was having thoughts or some type of, I don't know if it was a premonition, whatever you call it, but I had some type of awareness that something might be wrong with Lady Bird. And I have this thing that happens, is part of my spiritual gifting, but sometimes I know things that I that the normal person wouldn't know. And I was at a friend's house because Lady Bird had not come. And so I ended up going with my friend to her sister's house. We were young tweens, I guess you would call them. And, we would talk on the phone and had, kids we would talk with. But this particular time, I think she was on the phone and I kind of was off to myself, listening to some music. I remember laying down and just having just an overwhelming feeling of sadness and I guess grief now that I know better, and felt like she was saying, goodbye or letting me know that she was leaving.
When Ebony came home from her friend's house, her mother still hadn't gotten word from Princella. But they were trying to remain calm. Princella was an adult after all, and young people, they can get caught up in their lives. When Monday morning rolled around, though, the phone did ring. It was their neighbor who owned the dry cleaning business, and Kim got a call herself soon after.
The boss over the dry cleaner is the person who alerted my mom that she was supposed to open the store and she never made it, which was what made my mother start to call and question. I got one of those phone calls and it was, hey, have you seen Bird? Star has reported that she was supposed to open up the store. And what we know about my sister is that she was extremely responsible. So that brought up red flags, because if you asked her to do something and she committed to it, she was going to get it done. Something has to be wrong, because that's not like her. Mom was on jury duty that week. And for some reason, she got off early. I'm not sure. She got off early, and then she and my stepdad went over to the apartment.
When their parents left to drive to Inman Park, Ebony was alone in the house. It was frightening for her to be there. She felt the dread of her premonition from the weekend, and she just didn't want to be by herself.
I was left home, and my big brother was working up at the McDonald's. And, I think at that time I couldn't get mom to answer, and I just was like, well, I might get in trouble if I leave the house without her permission, but I'm going to go up here where my big brother is and, hang out up here, because I was just stuck in the house. So I ended up going up there with him.
It didn't take long for Marianne and her husband to arrive at Princella's apartment building. Kim recalls Princella's studio as being on the second floor, up a short flight of stairs. But her parents, she said, knew something was wrong before they even reached that door.
They knew immediately when they drove up, because they smelled what they later described as being the death smell. They saw the flies. And they didn't have a key to our apartment. And so they had to notify the police, who came out, and the management. And that's how they found her. Shot to death, left on her bed. In the middle of summer, July 1990.
The next few hours were a flurry of phone calls to relatives, to emergency services, trying to track down the children. Ebony remembers sitting in a booth at McDonald's when a manager came over to Curtis and said that someone was on the phone for him.
I was sitting on the fence like I'm either in trouble or something's going on with Bird. And so we didn't know. We just were told to come home. And so my brother scooped me up and we went home. When we came in, I think Kim was just getting there. And Kim, being the oldest and probably more keen to what was being said and transpiring, I don't know what my brother was feeling. We were all there in that moment.
What I remember about that day, you know how you get a call? So I got the call previously, but it didn't bother me because it was Bird. And, right. I didn't talk to her every day, So it just, she's somewhere. She'll be fine. But then when I got the second call, I was cooking. I was cooking chicken. You know how you season your chicken and you put your seasoning on it. And I just put the aluminum foil over. It was going to be baked. It never made it to the oven because I got the call and they said, come. They didn't say what happened. But when I got the call to come to the house, I dropped everything and we went. And I knew my stomach was not well because I knew something was not right. I couldn't imagine that they were going to tell me that my sister had been found dead. I thought maybe she's been in an accident. I never thought death. So when we got there, Mom shared that Bird had been found. And at the time she lived in DeKalb County. And at the time I lived in, I want to say Clarkston. So it was about a 30-minute drive. My sister and brother were still minors. They lived there. It was me who had to get there because they were there. But we were told at the same time.
Ebony told us what she remembers about that moment.
We were all just kind of stunned. My parents already knew, so they had a moment already prior to us getting there, to kind of get out whatever their initial shock was. But me being a kid, I didn't get a lot of it because, that wasn't, my parents were very traditional. That wasn't a conversation to have with a child. But I got the gist of it that she was no longer here, that they found her deceased. So that was very clear. What my older siblings got, I don't know, but that was the most I got of it. It's almost like I had an interaction with Lady Bird, maybe, as her spirit, was leaving. I don't know what that was, but I just had a profound sense of sadness, when I did go through that encounter by myself. But as I was there and hearing the news, understanding that I had that encounter and it was kind of like I had been clued in, I guess that kind of helped with the initial shock of it, right?
Kim, though, she didn't have any help with her shock. It just didn't feel real.
The first thing I was thinking was, you guys are not telling me the truth. I don't believe this. I never experienced anything like that before. I was 24 years old. I saw it on TV, but I had never experienced anything like this in my lifetime. I didn't know anybody who had experienced anything like this. So it wasn't really clear to me how to process it, how to take it in. And I remember I didn't talk a whole lot. It was almost like I couldn't talk about it. And I remember the disbelief of it. Like, I don't believe it. I would go places and I would expect to see my sister, and I'd look at buses and think, oh, there's Bird. And even though, we went through the memorial service and all of those things, she was cremated, I didn't believe it. It just wasn't registering for me. So those were the first thoughts going through my head. But afterwards, after all of that, started to question, well, wow, isn't the family the first person they're supposed to talk to? No one called me. Nobody asked me what I did or did not know. And of course, my siblings were younger, so it would have fallen on Mom. But then there was Mom saying, I'm not getting any information.
Next time on The Fall Line, the story of Princella Eppes' life, death, and the investigation into her murder continues. We'll hear from a retired APD lieutenant who was at the scene and who gives us some insight into crime in the area at the time, as well as an interpretation of some aspects of the case, and discuss roadblocks Princella's family has faced over the last 30 years, and the new hope they have for resolution with recent submissions of DNA for testing. Be sure to join us then. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscription and make sure you're set for automatic downloads so you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case in the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified person cases, is out everywhere now as hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books or through your local library. Find out more in the link in our show notes. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. If you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance this season by Melissa Gold. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka and Haley Gray.